Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. On the line with us is George Monbiot. He is the journalist and contributor to The Guardian, the author of numerous books, including his latest, Out of the Wreckage, A New Politics for an Age of Crisis. Monbiot, MONBIOT.com is his website, and you can tweet him at George Monbiot. George, welcome back to the program. It's been quite some time since you've been on.
Thanks, Tom. It's great to talk to you again.
I love your book, Out of the Wreckage, A New Politics for an Age of Crisis. In fact, we did a book report on it this morning, so the book report that plays for our nonprofit stations during the commercial break, the first 6 minutes of the show, when most stations are playing news and whatnot, it will appear. In fact, it did today.
Right.
And the chapter that I read, or I started out with, was chapter number 7, Our Economy, and you talk about how, at least I believe it was that chapter, you talk about how basically, Keynesianism has died, essentially, the 1,000 paper cuts sort of death. And what do you see emerging as a replacement for Keynesianism that people on, quote, the left could advocate as an economic policy?
Well, I would like to see the emergence of what I call the politics of belonging, where we build community as our primary political building block by developing far more robust, generous, inclusive communities, but then by transferring real political and economic power to those communities. And I see a sort of escalating series of steps towards doing that. First of all, you can look at the sort of thing they're doing in Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland, where a remarkable citizens' empowerment has taken place, mixing representative democracy with participatory democracy. And there you've got a situation where any citizen of the city can put forward a proposal for improving the city, and everybody else can then vote on that. It then goes to the council, which either has to accept it or provide a very good reason for rejecting it. And those very good reasons, those sort of reasoned arguments, have greatly encouraged faith in democracy there. And we now see an extraordinary situation where 2/3 of the city have been involved in this process. It's just as if government's been handed over to the people. And then step 2 is doing a similar thing with economic decision-making, with participatory budgeting, where you basically recruit as many citizens as want to be involved in setting the budget for the city, and I hope one day for nations as well. The classic example is where it all kicked off in Porto Alegre, where 50,000 people every year now set the city's budget. And it's been remarkable in that it's created a far more a well-distributed pool of wealth, much better sanitation, much better water quality, better primary health care, better primary schooling, better nursery places, just right across the board. It's got rid of corruption and clientelism. It's got rid of the mafia. It's had a transformative effect on the city.
In a way, it seems that you're describing something that harkens back to the Greek idea of the polis, that where you had to have 6,000 people to have a quorum and all that sort of stuff, that Aristotle and Plato decried. How would that, A, what do you think about that? And B, how would you do something like that in, for example, the United States?
Yes. Well, the thing is that I think there's loads of scope, especially now with digital technologies, to start to scale up such experiments so that they involve more and more people. When the Porto Alegre budgeting situation kicked off, people said, well, you're trying to involve far too many people. You can't possibly set a budget through all the citizens of the city. It's just going to be chaotic. But using digital technologies, using a very clever structure for meetings and devolution of power from one unit to another, they were able to do this with fantastic results. We see in the experiment taken even further in Rojava, the Syrian part of Kurdistan, where they're trying to build an entire political system from the small community level up. And there's no inherent reason why you can't build your politics to almost any scale by those means, especially once you start devolving genuine power to communities. And so I'd like to take it even further than those examples suggest and start looking at a transfer of power, not just from the state to people, to communities, but also from the very concentrated private oligarchy to communities. So, for instance, transferring real economic wealth from the hands of those who have enriched themselves massively at the expense of society into community land trusts, enabling people, communities to buy land and to sort out their own pressing problems, such as the lack of social housing, the lack of public amenities, by those methods. And so what I would do would be to introduce a very high rate of land value taxation on the most valuable urban real estate, to break the upward spiral of capital accumulation, which so drains society of its wealth and enriches a tiny handful of billionaires. Then to use some of the money generated by that land value taxation to provide community land trusts with capital, give them also a right to buy, a community right to buy, so that when land comes up for sale, they have first refusal, and then, having done that, provide the opportunity for them to develop their own sites and solve their own problems.
That's remarkable. That truly is remarkable. Another chapter of your book that I read starts out with the idea that the environment is, considered just an externality by economists and politicians by and large. And, there was a time perhaps when you could create an economic model and a political model that considered the environment in that context. There were so few people and there was so much environment. That time has long passed, as some would say centuries ago, certainly, half a century ago. And now, how do we create an economy and forms of governance that don't end up destroying the planet, fouling our own nest, ruining our own ability to have, a civilization or even just, decent lives?
Well, so there's a number of steps. And the first one, I believe that by shifting a considerable amount of wealth and economic power out of the private sector and into the commons sector, the community sector, you inherently are shifting from a primarily unsustainable system into a far more sustainable one. Because a true commons has a number of elements. First of all, there's a resource. Secondly, there's a particular community which manages that resource. And there's the rules and negotiations that the community creates to do so. But critically, that resource is inalienable. If it is a commons, it cannot be sold, it cannot be given away. And any products from that resource are shared on an equal basis. And what this means is that every member of the community has a very strong incentive to ensure that that resource is sustained. And by a resource, we could be talking about a river, we could be talking about a forest, a piece of land, a fishery. There's a whole series of things. And then, of course, human-made wealth as well could be used as a resource for a commons. But the important thing is that you can't just dispose of it and turn it into cash or into another form of capital. You can't sell off the soil by just basically mining it through unsustainable agriculture and then invest in a factory.
Here in the U.S., that was Teddy Roosevelt's idea, setting up the national park system. But now we've got Ryan Zinke. He's just sold off several, I think, millions of acres of public land to the highest bidder, to drillers, to miners, to ranchers and whatnot, and fixing to do it with a whole lot more. I mean, they just cut down bears' ears and all these other things. So, there's that old saying, power once taken is never ceded. I mean, how do we actually accomplish something like this?
Well, what you're talking about there are particular weaknesses of the state system, of state ownership. And while I think we still need a strong state, we also need a lot of devolution of power and wealth from the state to community groups so that you don't end up with split incentives. Where you've got a system where the state and the state alone can make a decision, well, all you need is for a lobby group to move in and capture the decision-making process, and hey presto, it's all gone. And those who have an interest in the long-term maintenance of the resource, their voices are muted, whereas the voices of the corporate lobbyists, the landowners, and the rest of it, those are very strong.
But even at the level of practical interactive democracy, I've seen this break down. I mean, here in Oregon, there was this was more than a decade ago. There was an attempt by the legislature to regulate the timber industry, and as I recall, they just simply put a ballot initiative on the ballot and ran millions of dollars worth of highly deceptive advertising to get this thing knocked down.
Yeah, well, this, of course, is a hazard anywhere. And look, I'm not claiming that handing it over to participatory democracy is a cure for all ills.
Right.
Apart from anything else, we have to curb the power of lobbyists and of campaign spending. And I know that in the US, you've got this particular problem, which is Citizens United.
Right.
And it's very clear to me that a sustained effort of the kind that Wolfpack and others have made to try to overturn Citizens United is absolutely essential for the political health of your nation. It's a crazy situation where you can just buy political results. And while that remains the case, almost any political transformation can be co-opted and corrupted.
Yeah, and all the more the tragedy. It's just, this is a very, very unhealthy situation for our democracy and for our planet. George Monbiot, you're brilliant. The new book is Out of the Wreckage, A New Politics for an Age of Crisis. Thank you so much for dropping by today.
Thank you, Tom. Total pleasure.
Great talking with you. And you can follow George's work also over at theguardian.com. But the book is Out of the Wreckage, and it's great. We'll be back in just a moment with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this.